Hey everybody, welcome back to my studio. My name's Kris. This channel is all about tips and tools and tutorials for growing in watercolor. In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how I painted this painting of a stone bridge over a stream. I'm going to show you step by step how I created this painting and so you can follow along. It took me about an hour to do this painting, but I'm going to show you how to do it in 17 minutes. If this sounds interesting to you, keep on watching and let's get started. I start by taking a natural sponge with water, clean water, and wet the back and now the front of my Bahong rough artist grade paper. This is 140 pound, 100% cotton paper. By wetting the back, it causes it to adhere to the board, so I don't have to worry about taping it down because it won't move because the back of the paper is wet. I am mixing up lavender, cobalt blue, cerulean blue, and a little bit of that green gold with some neutral tint in it to make it a little more of a neutral color. I'm squinting at my reference image and I'm just finding the general tones of the paper. I'm doing what's called killing the whites of the paper. I really want every part of the paper to have some kind of first wash on it, but a very light wash. So I'm looking for the general tones of color that I see in those areas, blue in the sky, green in the trees, in the background. I'm leaving, really the only place I'm leaving kind of white right now is the waterfall because the water there is pretty white. Oh, I'll take that back. I just put a lot of blue in that area. Now taking that blue and moving it down into the water, into the foreground. And so I've now covered the entire paper with that first wash. I've killed the whites. And I'm ready to set my timer to 20 minutes and go away and do something and let the paper dry. I come back, I kind of touch it, I see that it's just slightly damp. Paper's still pretty much sticking to the board. Now I take up my reference image here and I squint at it and I try to find what I would call the big connected shape from the bridge down into the rocks in the foreground and some of the foliage. And I want to paint that whole area with a continuous shape, connected shape that's a middle value. Different colors, not all the same color, of course, different colors, but all somewhat of a middle value. And this is a technique I learned from watercolor master Andy Evenson. He really teaches this technique to simplify your paintings by really connecting the major shapes, not having a bunch of distinct separate objects in your painting, but try to connect them. Helps guide the viewer's eye through the painting. Okay, now I'm mixing up a bunch of puddles of paint there on my palette. I want to be ready with all this color so I can quickly move from one color to the other. I'm starting with the bridge, neutral tint, some blue in it. I'm mixing a little bit of the burnt sienna. I don't want just a solid mass of color. I want this beautiful mixture and blending of color. It's what watercolor does beautifully, better than any other medium, is that real fluid mixing of colors and blending of different colors. Wherever I put the color on a bit too dark of a value, I just take my brush and lift the color and just lighten it a bit. I'm moving now from the bridge into the connected shape of the trees on the right, a little bit of trees above the bridge in the center left. And again, I'm just moving. I'm not trying to separate the trees from the bridge. I'm just seeing where they blend together there on the far right side and just emphasizing that. I am trying to keep hard edges around those little see-through windows at the top of the bridge. That's an important place to have hard edges. But other parts of this big connected shape, I want there to be very soft edges. And for example, here underneath the bridge in that shadow area. Again, a few places, if I feel it's a little too dark in value, I'm using the side of my brush, which is fairly dry, and just picking up or lifting color. All right, now I'm going down into the area of foliage underneath the bridge. Again, just connecting this one shape, moving from the bridge into the foliage, now into the water below the waterfall. Right below the water of the waterfall, it's fairly light there in the reference image, so I'm lifting the color there. Don't want it to get too dark. Moving over to the left side of the painting where it's a bit more green. As you can see, again, this is all just one connected middle value. Almost everything I put down in this stage, the second stage of the painting, is pretty middle value. If you had values from 0 to 10, kind of in the 3, 4, 5, 6 range of values throughout what I'm painting here right now. I am defining some shapes, the rocks, the foliage, the water. But again, everything's got kind of a soft edge to it. That's because I'm painting from one wet area into the next and just letting those edges blur with the colors. And coming now into the large rock, it's an important feature of the painting. This large shape there in the foreground. It's fairly dark. So now I've pretty much moved from, again, the top of the painting, the bridge, all the way down, and painted that middle value throughout that whole area. I'm going back up now to the waterfall itself, seeing that there are bands of middle value or darker value in between the white of the waterfall. And so remember when I painted that waterfall earlier, I painted kind of a blue tint, but it had dried. That was the underpainting. And it really doesn't look very blue now. When you paint these darker middle values up against that white of the waterfall looks pretty white. So again, those early values that I put, that very first wash that I put down, even though it had tone in it, even though it had color in it, when it dried quite a bit lighter. And some of those colors that I put down very strong in that first wash have really lightened up quite a bit. Now it's time to look back at my value study. In my value study, the lighter gray area is the middle value, and then you see the detail areas that are in darker value. And it's those darkest areas that I'm now going to put in. I've let the paper dry a bit more. And so now the first thing I want to do is take a fairly dry brush and just do some lifting. There were some areas in those middle values that got a little too dark, and especially there underneath that big rock, the water is really white there. And I want to emphasize that kind of foamy white water. Also there in the waterfall, got a little dark in some areas. So I'm taking this brush. Again, it's fairly dry, just damp. And I'm lifting the paint. That's a beautiful thing you can do with watercolor. Even after it's dried a bit, you can come back and lift and kind of get back some of the light areas that you might have painted over a little too dark. So I'm just looking for those areas. Again, waterfall in the water, above the rock, below the rock, there's some areas that are light. So here's my value study. Again, I'm taking a good look at it now. Now I'm ready to paint in these really dark details. And those details are really going to make the objects or subject matter in the painting really pop as I define some edges and some form. First thing I do is get some of my cobalt blue, some mixed with some burnt umber, creating a nice dark grayish color. And I'm just painting that real dark area that I see under the bridge. It's an important shadow. It will give shape to the bridge. I'm also kind of putting in some of the details that I see, the dark underside of that greenery that's along the bridge. If you want to take a look at the reference image for this painting, I will post it in a link in the description below, and you can follow along. It's important to take a look at that value study and just trying to get a right sense of the color and the values. I'm painting in picking up some browns now, and just painting some of the shadow area next to the tree on the right side of the bridge. Now I'm going to switch down to this really dark spot to the left of the watercolor. It's in the rocks there. It's helping to define the rocks and the underside or shadow side of those rocks. And again, we'll give some definition and shape to those areas. So I've got a pretty dark mixture of French ultramarine and probably burnt umber, which is a combination I like to use a lot to create a really bluish dark gray. And I'm painting in those shadow areas. And I'll put some paint down, and then I'll come back with a wet brush and just soften the edges because I don't want too hard of lines in some of these areas. I want them to blur a little bit to give a sense of shape there. And so now when you do these real dark details, unlike the middle value step, which I did previously, in these dark detail areas, your shapes are not necessarily connected. You can kind of jump from one part of the painting to another and just put in some dark details. And you can see I'm doing that here. I put in the details under the big rock to the left of the watercolor. Now I'm putting in some details in those little middle ground rocks in the middle of the stream. Now I'm coming in, putting some details in the big rock in the foreground. And so all these dark areas are not necessarily connected, and they don't necessarily need to be, because we already have the big connected shape of the middle values that are bringing the unity and the connection to the shapes, leading the eye through the painting. And now we just want to add some of these details in a darker value, mixing up some lavender with some cobalt, and seeing there's just some beautiful lavender colors in this foreground water below the big rock. So I'm putting those colors in there. Again, laying down the color, maybe coming back and softening the edges a bit. I see there's also some dark in that water in the foreground. So I'm taking my, again, French ultramarine burnt umber mixture, gray, and mixing that in, letting those blend together, creating that nice soft water look. There's even a little green in there. And just kind of letting all those colors meld and mix together to create the softness of the water. I'm trying to retain that white foamy area, though. I don't want to get too dark in there. I'm kind of going back up now into the water above the rock and putting in some greens. Now working on the foliage of the rocks on the left. Again, it's a dark shape. You always want to be squinting at your painting and just kind of not trying to paint too many details, but just getting the large shapes that you see and defining those and simplifying the painting as you go. This is a very complex scene, and it really took a lot of simplifying to avoid getting a painting that was too busy. So often, if you try to put in too many details, your painting gets really busy, and it's really hard for your viewer to know where to focus in the painting. Obviously, the focus of this painting is the bridge and the waterfall, and then even that large rock in the middle there with the water going by it. So those are the areas I focused on. Now I see that there's some trees. I feel like the background of the painting is just a little bit too white. It's like a big white, undefined region. And so decided I need to come in now with some greens and some browns. And I need to just put in some of the limbs and the branches that are kind of cutting across the kind of the top of the painting in the distant background. Because there's trees back there, and there's limbs, and there's all kinds of things. And so I'm taking a very fine, like a liner brush, number 1 round brush, very fine, and I'm just coming in and putting in little squiggles of paint and little lines that represent limbs and distant tree branches. You got to make sure that if you have a branch that comes up from underneath the bridge, that you continue it above the bridge so it looks like it kind of continues through space there. And looks natural. So I'm putting in that kind of detail in the trees areas. Coming in now to the far right underneath the bridge, and again just kind of adding little details here and there to kind of give a sense of the texture. I don't want just a big undefined space there. I feel like I needed a little bit of texture to show that it's moss-covered rocks. There's some different colored rocks in there and things like that. Trying to make it interesting. You can see I'm jumping around a little bit. I work in one area until I get it the way I like, then I move around to another part. This partly allows the paint to dry a bit in one area, and I go work on another area. Watercolor is all about gauging how wet your paper is and whether or not you can come back and put in more colors without getting blooms. So you have to constantly be aware of the level of water on the paper and the level of water on the brush, and to avoid any problems with blooms. So one of the ways to deal with that is to move around a little bit in the painting and work in one area, then come back to another area. Okay, now I see that there are shadows underneath each of those little half-round windows that go through the bridge. And so I want to define those shapes a bit better. So I'm taking a really dark mixture there and just kind of putting in those shadow shapes there. And now I'm doing the same with the under area of the bridge, coming back and darkening that a little bit just to get more definition. Again, the bridge is one of my key features of this painting, and I want to give it a real good sense of form and shape, so I need to have good shadow areas. Okay, now I've come back once again to that undefined kind of real light area in the background, and I'm putting in a bit more of the trees. If you look at the reference image, you'll see that that background is not nearly that white. It's really much more similar in value to the rest of the painting. But in my opinion, if I had painted that way background area too dark, too middle value, it would have caused the bridge to kind of get lost in the background. I really wanted there to be a strong contrast between the bridge and the background. So I really left the background much lighter in this painting than it was in the original reference. Again, having contrast between, for example, the background, the sky, and this bridge, which is so important, I wanted to have a lighter value in the far background. So I did that on purpose. It wasn't really true to the reference image, but again, that's artistic license. You have to decide what will work best to communicate your subject matter and to create contrast and visual, kind of a real good sense of the objects that you're trying to paint. So that was my choice there. Okay, I'm getting really close to being done now. Again, I'm just checking the painting for areas where I can add a little bit more detail. And by the way, this painting process is being recorded at 3 times normal speed. Obviously, I'm not painting it quite this fast in real life. I just wanted to speed it up so you could just kind of watch the whole thing and get a sense for what I'm doing and not have to watch every minute, every second of the painting process. The overall painting process in real life took me 53 minutes, but I've reduced this video down to about 17 minutes or so. So it's about 3 times faster than normal. Okay, I'm going to grab some of my bluish gray, which would be French and ultramarine, and burnt umber, that grayish color. I'm going to now just put some little marks on the side of the bridge. The bridge is an old classic stone bridge, and so there is some texture on the surface of the bridge. I want to give a sense for that, so I'm putting that in, coming back and darkening that area of shadow underneath that main rock under the bridge, seeing some of the other little details in that foliage area, defining a bit more the dark areas around the waterfall. These are just small little details as I keep looking at the reference image, things I think might help render this painting a little bit better. Again, it's a highly simplified version of the painting. My process was to first do a first wash to kill the whites, putting down very light values of a first wash just to get rid of the stark white of the paper, then do a big connected shape in middle value, and let that dry, and then come back with the darkest values and just put in the details. This is the way you have to work in watercolor. You work, unlike other mediums, you work from light to dark. Other mediums like oil, you work from dark and you can add lights later. You can't do that with watercolor. Okay, I've pretty much finished the painting. I've mixed up a nice dark mixture, and I'm putting in my signature in the lower right corner. Thanks for watching this tutorial. Hopefully you found it to be helpful. And if so, you might want to consider subscribing to this channel. I put out videos like this, watercolor tutorials, tips, and different tools that I use in my studio. And if you like what you see, consider subscribing.